Have you ever wondered what makes creative people tick? Where do their ideas come from? What keeps them energized? What kinds of things get in their way? Is their life as much fun as it looks from the outside? Hello, I'm your host, Lily Pierpont, and this is ArtStorming, a podcast about how ideas become paintings or poems, performances, or collections. Each episode, I'll chat with a guest from the arts community, and we'll explore how the most creative among us stare down a blank canvas or reach into the void and create something new. Today I'll be ArtStorming with Michael Bergt. If you look at Michael's website, which I highly recommend that you do, you may notice that he doesn't list any specific art training, which is totally surprising given that you might think he studied with Botticelli or another Renaissance painter directly. His use of gold leaf, egg tempera, and tight penwork suggests years and years of training under a master. And in a way, that's what he's done, only he's the master. In this conversation, you'll discover the secret to Michael's methodology. His technique, combined with his inexhaustible capacity to riff on a theme, be it mythology, theology, sexuality, or the psyche, helps explain his extraordinary body of work. All right, so I'm sitting here with my buddy Michael, and it's been a while since I've seen him, but not as long as some of the other guests that I've been interviewing because we stay in pretty close contact. But I'm going to start with Michael the way I've started with everybody, which is to ask him something about himself that listeners might not be able to discover by looking at your website. So I gave you a second to think about it. You have an advantage over some of my other guests.
Thank you for that.
But so what do you think that is? Something about yourself that somebody couldn't find out about you on your website?
Well, I was just telling you before, I think this is something I've been reflecting on lately. And it's kind of a reflection that was born out of this last session I did in Rome teaching. And for me, teaching has been this sort of process of trying to understand what I know and how to explain it to someone else, and then try to understand where they are and what they need, and then to see what lands and why. And so, like this morning, I had this exchange with one of my students this summer who's studying with Fred Wessel, who's another egg tempera painter. And she was explaining to me this whole procedure that he lays out and this whole sort of documentation of how to get there. And she said, but I still like your process better because it's faster and more direct and you retain the form and the colors. And I was like, well, yeah, that's because my way is to reverse engineer. I'd never had the kind of formal training that said, this is your step 1, 2, 3, 4. Mm-hmm. I developed these steps by reverse engineering. I would see the end result and I'm like, how do you get there the most efficient way? And it's like, and then I realized this is how I've sort of lived my life. You know, there's so many times, like I dropped out like 2 different colleges and because there was something in me that said, I knew how to do this. I knew if you would give me what the end result was that you're trying to achieve, I could figure out a way to get there better than probably what you could teach me, but I couldn't explain what that is. And so I think that's sort of the core of my fascination with life and people and art and everything else is like, I know I can figure out a key that no one else has quite seen because I'm going to approach it in a way no one else quite does. Because I don't come with it already preconditioned to say, these are the 5 elements that bring you there. Right. I'm like, well, I don't know what those 5 elements are. I'm just going to figure out what is happening and what are the things that could possibly feed in to make that happen.
Well, what's so interesting to me about that is that, I mean, you're such a technically skilled artist. I mean, nobody would look at your work and think that you didn't have the formal education of a Renaissance painter. You know, I mean, what you bring to it, I mean, not just the subject matter, but the actual technical skill. And so it's so interesting to hear you say that you're coming about it from a reverse engineered kind of place.
Yeah.
Because this is really one of the reasons that I'm doing this podcast is to help non-artists understand that there are ways to approach life, or the way artists approach life are kind of usually outside the box. And this is like a perfect way to start a conversation about out of the box.
Actually, I mean, I spent most of my life with this huge imposter syndrome, thinking, you know, somehow, someone's going to figure out he doesn't know what the hell he's doing, and yet he comes up with this incredible stuff. How did that happen? You know, and so for me, it's just been like, I sort of slyly take workshops and stuff and sort of backfill this information and go, oh, that's how they did that. I already get there, but now I understand that's how you're supposed to do it.
Oh, wow.
And so for me, it's like, okay, then that gives me skills to sort of have the sort of language or the dialogue or the procedures that might help people. But then ultimately, it's like, no, the objective is, you're trying to make this work, and then how do you make something work? And that really is the key.
Well, that explains the technical side of things, which you do so incredibly well.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
But then there's like, where the hell do these ideas come from? I mean, of all the people I know, I mean, and you and I, just a little bit of backstory.
Right.
The day that we met, I think we ended up speaking for 6 hours. I mean,
exactly.
We started with coffee, and then it just went off the rails.
Right.
So, and you and I have been doing that ever since. And it's been 6 years already, and every time we get together, it's the same thing.
Right.
And where we go is usually who knew? We never set out where we're going to go. It just goes there, right?
Yeah.
And I know that you have this endless source of, well, I don't know where you take me, but we go there, and it shows up in your artwork. I mean, you take things that are, you know, recognizable themes, the classical themes, but then you twist them all up and come up with something entirely new. So what's your process for accessing that? And just talk about that.
Well, I mean, because I think what you and I both share is this fascination with connecting dots. And it's like there's something within your psyche that says this is something I explain to people. Like, I think everyone is born with a question. And you spend most of your life trying to figure out how to answer that question. And what you're drawn to or what you're fascinated by is part of that question. You know, it gives you the tools or the ingredients that you need to know about to actually dive in and uncover that bigger question. And so, you know, there are times when, you know, like you're working on a series of paintings or you discover a new artist or a new medium or something, and suddenly you're clicking on all these.
Clicking.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're starting to connect these dots, and then suddenly things make sense. It's like, oh, this is why I did this then, and this is why I did that, and this is why I took those classes, and this is why I have that. Because suddenly they all fit together to make this product happen. And it wouldn't have happened in a linear fashion because it's a very organic process. Right. And this is a discussion you and I have. It's like at a certain point you have to really have faith in the process, and that you realize the process is the thing, not necessarily the end result or not necessarily the steps, but it's like, how do you engage with this process that informs you, and it can come out of nowhere.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, especially for somebody like you. I mean, I think of you as almost like a really, really excellent musician, because you're so good at your craft that I can't imagine that even though you just said you had to figure out how to reverse engineer to figure out how to do what you do, but you are so skilled that I have a hard time imagining that you're like worrying about how you're going to get from point A to point B in terms of your technical skills, so that it frees up all of your energy to think about how you're going to develop an idea. Yeah,
well, I think that's the course of one's career. I think anyone working in the arts or any sort of discipline, there's a huge period where you are learning the craft. And at a certain point of excellence, that becomes a secondary nature to you. Like, you just sit down and you play the piano. Yeah. You know, you're not trying to figure out which keys are going. And so then what's next is you're dealing with connecting dots. You're dealing with, okay, what am I going to talk about? What am I trying to say? Why am I fascinated? Why am I using this medium? You know, what is it that's possible? What is it that optimizes what it is I know? And can I just reduce it to those? Can I sort of narrow the parameters and say, within this space I have unlimited sort of exploration? And I think it's something a lot of people have a hard time doing with their life. They keep thinking they have to keep everything wide open, having these unlimited potentials of doing any number of things, and you can never really focus on anything because you're trying to keep everything too wide. And at a certain point, when you narrow it down to go, it's like this last series. I said, okay, I'm dealing with black and white, I'm dealing with ink, I'm dealing with cross-hatching, I'm dealing with gold. And that these all have metaphorical significance for my skill level. It's like what I can do with a line, few people can do. What I can do with gold and juxtapose, few people. What I can do with and so it's like, okay, these are my elements, and I'm going to put these in the mix and just play with that mix and stay within those parameters. Mm-hmm. And then when you do that, suddenly you start connecting all kinds of dots. Yeah. You can start making realizations.
In the constraint, you have freedom.
Unlimited freedom. Yeah. And then you begin to start to deal with, so what is it that you're really, what is it that you're really wanting to talk about or deal with or understand or illuminate, and then you just keep following that thread.
So do you set out to explore a theme, sort of say, do you keep notes or something? You were just in Italy teaching a class. I mean, did you come back with sort of a whole plethora of things that you want to explore, or how does that work for you? You just sit down one day and today we're doing whatever?
Well, one thing I noticed myself doing over time, and it's again goes back to this sort of the course of the career, is like, I used to go to museums and I'd sketch little things about paintings, details or, how something was rendered or color relationships or this and that. And then I would start to do that less and less and less. And then I would just stop in a painting and go, something about this theme, it was like, whatever the theme was that fascinated me. And then I would notice that, more of those sort of themes fascinated me. So then I realized, okay, it had something to do with that dynamic, that narrative. And then you begin to go, well, then what about that narrative is fascinating? And then you start reducing it to, okay, how was it that they painted that suddenly made that work and this other one didn't work? So it wasn't just the narrative, it was something about how they interpreted that narrative that made it functional. And so it becomes more and more subtle and nuanced and intricate in terms of, the difference between what makes something really powerful and what just makes it, a nice painting or an interesting pursuit in one's life. You just go, now it's like your first question. What is it that no one knows about you that might mean something very significant about how you've actually lived your life?
Yeah.
That's a question very few people can answer or maybe even reflected upon, because it's so easy to just name your resume. Just list your accomplishments and say that's who you are.
Yeah. But it's that dynamic between being sort of the extrinsic expectations that the world puts on us.
Exactly.
And the intrinsic expectations or just hopes that we explore within the privacy of our own realm.
Yeah, it's like who it is to be who you are, doing whatever it is that people think is excellent. It's like that's an entirely different. Like how many people know that so many famous actors are afraid of being in public,
right,
or afraid of performing, and yet they do it so beautifully.
Yeah.
And it's like it's counterintuitive, sure, but so much of that is in our psyche. Whatever it is that's going on there, it's compensated by however we express ourselves in the world in some way.
Well, speaking of intricacies, because I think the first series that I purchased from you were working on the Minotaur series.
Right, yeah.
And so that was an exploration of the masculine-feminine principle as sort of
polarity between the two.
Polarity, yeah. And you did how many drawings or
I must have done a series of maybe 30 or 40 drawings of those.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's a very specific thing, and yet you found that many ways to depict it.
To explore that theme, that idea, yeah.
And you just kept going and going, and I'd see, it's really hard to be a consumer of your work because
as
soon as you finish, you find the piece.
It's like that's a better one. I wish I'd have done that one.
Yeah, it's like if I'd waited 3 weeks, I could have that one, and then and it just keeps going.
But then they can just end it someday. Someday you just go, okay, I'm not exploring that anymore.
Well, it's interesting to see how now I think Minotaur series morphed into, did we go Minotaur right into COVID? And then you went into Metamorphosis?
I think that was probably the transition. Yeah.
Yeah, so we went from exploring these polarities to here we are all, we're all sequestered.
Right,
and we all had to just go within and deep. And then you did this wonderful series of Metamorphosis, which was sort of the chrysalis becoming the butterfly.
Right, this potential, that this collective idea that we're all being in isolation, it was an opportunity to actually transform the self in some way. And so, we could view this as, a hindrance or a restriction, or as actually an opportunity. And that was, how I was seeing COVID, that it was an opportunity for all of us to sort of, and I think for some people, I think it did work, and other people it didn't. They just suddenly emerged and was like, thank God it's over. I'm now back to whoever I was.
Right. So, and then what happened after the COVID series? You're sort of in a new place now.
Yeah, I think this latest series was mostly about this whole idea of the unconscious and the conscious, and the figure standing in a body of water, and that there were all these sea creatures or winged creatures or whatever, and there were elements of, I saw them as metaphorical elements of the self, the submerged self, or the higher self, that were always present. We're not always conscious of them, and there's this capacity for the two to actually connect with one another, interact, and for us to be conscious of them. And what does that mean, to be conscious of it? What does that mean to actually be aware of that? And that's all part of who we are as human beings. And so, that's kind of, where this whole journey has led me to.
Right. And and you draw on, in terms of your imagery, some of it is very unique to you. Some of it draws on mythology.
Sure,
or sort
classical
of
references,
images. But somehow you always make it very new and fresh and interesting. And so I'm just curious, like when you, I'm trying to think of the most recent piece that I've seen of yours. Yesterday, you posted, there was a man with sort of an octopus on his head.
Oh, a woman, yeah. Actually, there was a commission piece, yeah. Well, this is curious to me because when I came back from Rome, and I wasn't sure yet what I wanted to do because I saw so much art, and I was just filled with imagery and the experience of teaching and processing everything about. Because I had like 2 one-person shows back-to-back earlier this year, and they were both sort of on the same theme, the sort of surfacing. And I'm like, wow, what am I going to do now? What happens next? And then I had this person who wanted me to do this commission that I just put aside because I said, I got too much going on this year. And so what it was is she and her husband would always go to parties, and they'd wear squid on their head, these squid hats on their head. They were like, this is party. And there was something about that she thought was very reflective of them and their relationship and how they approached life and everything else. And so she wanted this image of her with like a squid on her head. And I did some drawings, and the shape of the squid didn't quite work. So she said, well, let's try an octopus. So I did an octopus, and suddenly, it was working. And so in the process of doing this, I was like, oh my God, this is kind of a really interesting pivot for me, because it's like I was doing all these paintings about, octopus and squid under the surface and are unconscious that they were not aware of. And suddenly this woman is taking one and wearing it on her head. So it was almost like, what does it look like when we own the sort of discarded aspects of the self and move through the life and wear that?
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, that could be the pivot to a whole new idea of like, what does that look like if we start owning the discarded aspects of the self? So, instead of having, underwater and above and all that. So, but I don't know where that's going. I don't know what that is.
Like
but it's just...
It's an integration.
Right.
So
yeah, well, that's it. The theme is integration. Yeah. In so many of those drawings, it was like the fish reaching up and the heron reaching down, trying to connect. It's this desire for integration of that. And so I think that's the underlying theme.
Well, what I love about it, too, is it's almost... not only is it about integration, it's also about kind of the vulnerability that comes with owning who you are.
Oh my God, yeah. Because it could be absolutely an absurdity. In that image, in some ways that's an absolute absurdity. But you can see in her face, she is absolutely joyous. She's absolutely loving this. And I'm like, That's perfect. It's perfect. You can love the fact that, whatever this is, that you want to be who you are, and you're just owning it.
Well, here's a pivot because, we're approximately the same age, and this is part of the journey that you can almost only get to when you get to be our
Yes,
age.
unfortunately.
You have to do a lot of living, except that you have a daughter.
Yes.
You recently had a slightly younger partner.
Yes.
And so do you see the people of that younger age able to integrate and kind of own their stuff earlier than people from our generation? Or you still see them do you think they're going to have to go through all the same
Well, I think there's a lot of changes individually. Some people are certainly more self-aware and interested and able to go there than others. But I do think a lot of younger people are pretty much disillusioned with the idea of society's patterns that they've given them for what they call success or the way to live a life. I think they've found them to not be worthwhile. Whether or not they find something alternative that actually is fulfilling, I don't think is across the board represented. But I think those who do, I think they maybe have, like my daughter, I mean, she's just absolutely driven and like a force of nature and accomplishing things I could never have done at her age. And she's fearless about it. I'm like, I have no idea how you got that, why you do that, why you believe that, and why you make that happen, but you do, and, I celebrate it.
Yeah.
And so in that case, I think she's probably a good example of someone who, while there might be some things that age and experience, whatever, would really temper and give her a spectrum that she doesn't have now, what she does have is something that's pretty extraordinary for someone at that age to have the ability to believe in something and focus and actually follow through with it. Because I don't think that's something that happens. Yeah, well, we were sort of
in our time. There was a lot of conventional. There were a lot of conventional expectations that we had to break through until we could go even begin our journeys. And I think the kids now, all those expectations have been kind of blown apart.
Yeah, sure.
And if they weren't blown apart before COVID, they got blown apart by COVID. So as much as I feel for those kids who had to go through high school and later part of high school and college during COVID where their communities were completely fractured, in a way it freed them up from the conventional idea that you graduate and then you get a job and then you go to the office and you pay your dues the way we did or didn't.
Sure, yeah.
We didn't do it. But if we didn't follow that path, there was a stigma.
Yeah.
And so those kids, I imagine, don't really quite have that. They have a lot more liberty.
And maybe in some ways this kind of addresses what I was talking about earlier about reverse engineering. In some ways they are reverse engineering their lives. Mm-hmm. They are being forced to move directly into something that is their passion or something that defies the convention in terms of, okay, you need to do this, get married, have kids, and then you can do this. It's like they just jump all the way to, go again. And so the question becomes, at some point, what price do you pay for backfilling some of that? To go, so often you hear about, successful women who somehow forgot that they wanted to have a family. And suddenly they're 45 or something, and they're going, oh my God, I thought there was always time or this would happen. I was doing everything that it was expected of me, and suddenly this didn't happen.
I'm reminded of that Roy Lichtenstein piece, and it's a woman with her head in her hands, and she's saying, she's by a photocopier, and she's like, oh my God, I forgot to have children.
I mean, it isn't a joke, but I mean, I think it is part of this sort of push in the evolution of our culture, which is to follow your passion, follow your bliss, do whatever, and at a certain point, there was a structure to society that enabled us to go from A to B to suddenly get to the point, like you said, where we find ourselves in a life where it's like, now I've had the job, I've had the family, I've had the marriage, I've had the kids. Now I'm free to do whatever it is because I've sort of have to paid my dues, so to speak, living the conventions.
Right, and then there the women that I was going to bring through this studio with urban art tripping. I mean, they were that exact demographic. It was these women. They'd paid their dues, and now they were facing a little bit of a crisis of imagination. Like, what do I do?
Right.
Now, those of you who are, artists who stare down a blank canvas every day, I mean, that's you're used to that conversation.
Right, that's part of the process.
Daunting. If you wake up one day and say, "Oh my God, now what am I going to do?" Everything
I identified with for meaning for what I needed to do in my life has now gone off and done their own thing, and now I'm stuck here going, now what?
Yeah.
Major stuff. Well, it's major life transitions.
And I think that these younger kids who maybe are bypassing that or reverse engineering it, I wonder where their sense of wonder and imagination come from, because now what they don't have that we grew up with were books and radio and things that weren't like visually telling them exactly how to look and how to be. I mean, we all had some version of that, but it's I wonder where the source of wonder and awe is going to come from for those, or how does somebody who's ready to face what's next, like how do they connect with wonder and awe and that thing that's going to light them up, the what's next? Any thoughts about that?
I don't know. I
mean, the faucets may be like always turned on for you. So have you ever hit a point where you don't know what's going to, like what you're going to do next?
Of course, all the time.
Really?
Sure, yeah.
Like for 10 minutes?
Yeah, for 10 minutes. Yeah. You're right. I mean, I haven't had prolonged blocks in my career where it's just like, I don't know what to do. I'm blocked.
I can't imagine you with a blank piece of paper and sort of sitting there scratching your head thinking,
well, I think I read something that was really good years ago that said, never come to a full stop. Always have something that you're working on or doing or having in the works so that you don't have to start up from a complete stop. Yeah. So, I mean, for me, it's like, I'll always just book like a modeling session and just do some drawings. And, it's something like that will always sort of start something for me in terms of a narrative or a pose that suggests something. And
and that's something I'd like to highlight, because you do work with live models, and there's a kind of interaction there.
Oh yeah, that's its own dynamic.
You've got somebody else's psyche that is suddenly in your literal space.
Absolutely, yes, yeah.
So you play with that, obviously.
Well, I mean, I sort of realized a while back, one of the things that I came to realize was this idea that none of us is hip enough to have all the information. We can think that we can solve all our own problems or figure things out, or we know what we're looking at in the world, or we have all the perspectives, but we don't. It's very singular and it's very insulated. And that once you open that process up to have another person to be a part of it, suddenly it's like the sum of the parts is greater than the individual pieces, and I find that dynamic for me working with someone. It's like if I see someone and it's like, oh my God, I see paintings working with that person. I already know I'm sort of predisposed to find something in that process. It may work, it may not. I mean, in terms of whether or not they are going to show up in a way to make that happen. But if it does happen, suddenly they will introduce, either in conversation or in pose or in dynamic, an element that I hadn't expected to be there, or something that I recognize suddenly, this is what I've been looking for, and I didn't even know it. And it wouldn't have happened because I couldn't have self-generated it. Right. It only happened in collaboration with someone else. Right. And so I find that it's a very important ingredient in creativity, is to have some element of collaboration so that you can introduce something in the mix that is beyond what you can create.
Right. So it's that spark, that kind of magic.
Yeah.
And
it's just like, it's why, when I go to museums, it's like I want to see something that surprises me in how they solve something that goes, okay, that gives me a clue for what it is I need to start mining.
Right.
Because otherwise I wouldn't.
You've already figured out, I mean, just your because you've been doing this for so long, either through going to a museum or inviting a model in, you have those built-in sparks.
Right,
Conversation with me.
Yeah, absolutely. I've told you several times that the next day after you left is like, oh my God, I just solved 3 problems from the conversation we've had yesterday. And it's just again, it's just like, well, that is the magic. That is the magic that we all know is embedded in life, and it doesn't always manifest. It only manifests with people who show up and are present for it.
Yeah. Well, that's what's so cool about, being this age, I think, is that the courage that we have to just sort of throw something out there that, to dare to have a conversation that you wouldn't necessarily have at a cocktail party or, with your colleagues at work. But there are like certain people that you
wouldn't be appropriate.
You dare to go there.
Yeah.
And I think that daring to go there is, and I was talking to another artist yesterday, and we discussed the concept of permission. And I think it's like granting each other permission to just sort of plumb depths of something.
Right. Well, that's like the creative process too. That's the collaboration. Is someone else who introduces something, and then you either have permission or not to address it in a way that takes it to the next place, and then it gets bounced back, and then and then it's a tennis match then.
Yeah. So do you feel like you are in dialogue with the pieces that you're working on?
Oh, absolutely. When I look back, it's like all the work that I've done documents where I was psychically at that time in my life. It's sort of
so it's like a dialogue with your past self. I mean, each canvas represents.
It's autobiographical of what it is that I'm fascinated with, or where I am at that stage of consciousness in my life. I mean, that was the retrospective catalog. I set it up in terms of these different series of work. So the evolution of my work is more like the evolution of consciousness than it is, moving from one sort of subject to another subject. It is more about an evolution of consciousness that brings those series into play.
So when you look at really early work of yours, and you can see a younger man, I would imagine.
Sure, yeah.
But what's it like? I mean, do you remember being that man, or can you even separate looking?
You know the thing that's really spooky for me, and I often wondered when I was that age, and I had several really important people that sort of mentored me and took me under their wing and made my career happen. And I that whole time I'm looking and going, I don't know why they were wanting to help me or what they saw or whatever. Now I look back and I see some of that work and I'm like, God damn, I wish I was that fertile again. There was something about every one of those images was just potent to the nth degree.
So now you see what those mentors saw.
It's just like the stuff was just exploding out of me that I had no idea what that was or where it came from or what I was connecting. Or it's taken me a lifetime to sort of distill that into something that sort of made an organizational sense. But at that time, it was like I could just. I remember I was doing an illustration for a poet friend of mine, and I would read a poem and I'd boom do a drawing, read a poem, boom do a drawing, and then he would introduce another poem, boom I do another drawing. He said, "Man, I've never seen anyone so facile," and I'm just like, "What do you mean?" I'm just responding, and it's like there was something about me then that was so naive that there was nothing blocking that ability to just respond and create, and then over time, I think you start building up all these, that doesn't sell. I need to do this. I have to have that, and it just becomes more complex to get that sort of free. It's like Picasso who said it took him a lifetime to become a child again. It's like, how do you get to that place where you can be that sort of fresh and open and responsive to the stimuli, but then bring everything that you've gathered from your entire life into it and funnel it and then imbue it with that.
Well, that's so interesting because it makes me think of several things simultaneously, but one is sort of like art school, which, you know, so many people who are creatives choose that path.
Of course,
and, you know, they have that spark that you were talking about. And I don't know if the stage you were talking about was pre-art school or during art school or whatever. But then they kind of get burdened with all the do's and the shoulds and shouldn'ts and the market pressures of, especially if they're a good artist and become commercially viable. Then there's the pressure from the art world. And then that shift that happens, that unburdening, and to find that access to that creative source again.
Exactly. Yeah. It's its own process. You know?
Have you had the opportunity to speak to any of your mentors? Have they lasted long enough, I mean, in terms of age, to be able to say, oh, wow, you know, now I see in myself what you saw in me, or something to that extent?
Not directly. I mean, John Pence is still alive. He's not very communicative with anyone, even Will, who was, you know, it's probably the star discovery. He was the most insightful in terms of recognizing who I was at a very early age, and basically telling me, stop doing all this other thing, focus just on these things, and give me a show based on these principles. And then, you know, we went from there to the next step, and you know, he and I had this conversation just the other day. It's just I would talk to him about, you know, what I thought life was, or how things worked, or, you know, what I believed, and he would just look at me and go, "Where did you get that idea?" And I'm like, "Well, I don't." And he said, "That's not how it works." And then he would explain to me, this and this and this create that, and then you do this so that this happens. And I'm like, and it was just like someone just told me someone just took the world and flipped it upside down for me, and said, you know, suddenly, you know, it could actually function completely differently than I thought it was working. And
about what age were you when this
I was like 22, 24 years old at the time. Yeah. Completely changed my whole orientation to, you know, what it was to be a professional artist, how the business worked, how you lived your life, who you met, you know, all this sort of stuff. You know, completely different experience than someone who, say, went through art school, you know.
Well, and so when you look at your daughter or other young artists, do you kind of feel compelled to give them the same, you know, leg up?
It's sort of, it's funny. It's because Sienna's sort of at this place in her life and her career where she begins to see that who I am is someone that made work what she's trying to make work in her life. And so now she wonders what it is that I did or how I do what I do that might apply to who she is and how she's going to do what she does, which is like a godsend to me because, you know, suddenly I can share something that I'm passionate about in terms of, you know, what I believe the art process is and, you know, where the magic lies.
Special father-daughter
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think for both of us, I mean, for her, when she sees it and it applies and it works for her, she's like, I learned from the best, you know. It's just, that's sweet. Yeah.
So what is your opinion of art school then? I mean, for the younger listeners out there.
You know, my view right now is that there are like two simultaneous tracks that are happening in art training. One of them is a university system that is very much based in kind of conceptual, sort of intellectual, sort of... I don't know so much about technique, but more just about, you know, a concept of art. Another one is like this whole system of the atelier programs. I mean, and this is something that is just, you know, boomed in the last 25, 30 years. And it's a very rigorous sort of academic training that teaches people, you know, sound techniques, sound painting practices, you know, historical references, every sort of thing.
Presumably so they would develop the same level of skill that you have so that they can...
Yeah, no, I mean, the idea is you're trying to create a whole other school of academically trained artists, and that's the secret. And, you know, and there are pitfalls to both tracks. You know, I keep telling everyone who goes through the atelier system, you know, at some point you have to stop doing the schools and start doing you. At some point you have to start saying something.
Isn't that true for civilian life too? I keep referring to people not as non-artists as civilians.
Right.
In my world, that's sort of how they occur.
Yeah.
What you just described as the two sort of tracks for the art school education seem to also apply to just like how we do life. In general.
Yeah.
And I think that your advice about at a certain point, you've just got to do you.
You got to do you, yeah. And hopefully there's something to you that is worth expressing and getting out there, or
But it's how does one cultivate that you, that internal you, when there are so many things in the culture that are telling you to be like this?
Yeah.
I mean, how did you do it? How did you navigate that?
Again, it's just there's something within you, and I think it goes back to that core response I had, where like I'm going to reverse engineer something. It's just like no matter what is out there, I keep looking at it, going, I think I could figure this out differently than the way it's being explained. Somehow it doesn't quite make sense to me. Somehow this doesn't seem like the best way to do this. Or somehow there's something dysfunction in here, and I know if I reflect on it long enough, I'll see what that missing ingredient is.
Well, there's a kind of inner confidence that is present.
It's a strange thing. There's an inner confidence, and then there's this imposter syndrome going on simultaneously. It's like, I don't know if I'm going to pull it off, but I sort of have a sense that I will, and I've done it enough times that I trust it's going to happen.
Well, I think that's key, is that you have done it enough times. Because I think for those of us who sort of played by the rules, and, particularly women of my age, there are a lot of rules to be played by.
And you're not necessarily encouraged to step out of the
In fact,
line.
it's pretty darn scary or dangerous.
Daunting, sure.
So even if, I've always admired people who said, screw it, I'm going to do it my way, because they had enough of a sense of my way. Like coming through the ranks, the idea of how I want it, and it's like I didn't even factor into the equation. And I'm still maybe even just figuring that out, which is why I have a lot of sympathy for women who are empty nesters, who kind of played by the rules, and then all of a sudden they're facing this big wide open. Right? But there must have been something with you, and you grew up in a conventional, conservative, Midwestern context. But something was in you that had you break out of the mold. What do you think that was? We recognize that in each other, but I certainly don't. I'm not an example of somebody who said I had enough sense of self to say, "Oh no, I'm going to go do it this way." There may be little micro examples in my life where I kind of veered off the path ever so slightly, and maybe some people who know me from my conventional life would say, "Are you kidding? You were total." Not play by the rules, but I see myself as a play by the rules. But what was it for you?
It felt like it felt like you were playing by the rules because you hadn't given yourself full permission yet. Yeah. I
guess maybe that's it.
I often tell people there's nothing in my past that should have betrayed the fact that this is how I would end up. I should have been completely... you're talking about a small town in Nebraska that was primarily German Lutheran farmers and very conventional, very conservative. There were no art galleries, no museums, no art schools, no nothing. It's like, why did I, at 5, tell everyone I was going to be an artist? Where in the hell did I come from?
I see. Now that would have been the perfect opener. Like I knew when I was 5. I told everybody when I was 5.
But I think that might be on my website somewhere. But it's like there's no reason that should have surfaced at all.
Wow.
I have no idea where that came from.
And you had no older siblings or cousins or anybody else?
No one in the family was an artist or anything else. I did have some experiences where, at that time there was like art classes in elementary school.
What a concept.
Yeah, what a concept. And that was always where, it was always like, okay, let Michael do it. He can draw. It's like I had those chops from early on. So it's like that was a real identity that I had from the very beginning. So it was like, okay, this is where I know.
And so you got encouraged.
I did it from that regard. Sure. Yeah. I got encouraged.
And then how did you make your way from Nebraska to Santa Fe?
Well, it actually, when I was 8, my parents moved to Denver, and thank God, because I don't think I ever could have flourished in Nebraska to become an artist. And they moved to Denver. And then it basically, I mean, I kind of had, I had sort of odd sort of experiences around art and education at that time. There was my third grade class in North Glen, Colorado. I had to take home a note to my mother saying, Michael is disturbing class because he's drawing in class. And I was terrified. I would
love to send that note to that artist, to that teacher.
I was terrified that, this was going to be, a horrible thing. And my mother read it and said, who is this teacher anyway? This is ridiculous. And, so thank God she had that foresight, and so she didn't discipline me for that. But it was funny. I remember there was a substitute teacher that obviously the teacher warned her about me, because she set me aside and said, we're going to do the classes, but then later I'm going to let you do your drawing and you can show us what you've done. I'm like, this is a freaking brilliant teacher. Yeah. And it's the teacher I should have had in third grade. But that was...
Well, I'm not too worried about the obstacles you had to overcome to become you, because obviously no problem there. But I mean, so you were in Denver then, and you made your way to Santa Fe, and I have a reason for asking this question, which I'll get to.
Okay, well, it's circuitous. I mean, first I went to San Francisco, and that's where I met my first dealer, was in San Francisco, and it was... I was working for a man in Denver who had a party rental business. So I was painting backdrops, making props, making theme parties and doing all that stuff for him. And he had a friend of his who was opening a business in San Francisco, and he talked him into commissioning me to do a work, and I did a painting for him. And he said, oh, why don't you come out one summer and paint a show, and then when I open the office in San Francisco, we'll do an opening of your show. And so that's what brought me out there. And so I was out there, and I was working that whole summer, and I did that show. And, you hear about these things all the time, and, it's what everyone does. It's like you're doing a show in a coffee house or something like that. It's not a venue that's seriously for art. It's an office, a real estate office that you're doing a show for. So it's, it's not a major thing, but it's major if you're 21 years old, And so that was when I actually took a walk up and down. And this is like the last 3 or 4 days I was in San Francisco before. I was actually San Rafael before I left to go back to Denver. And I took a walk up and down Sutter Street, because that's where all the galleries were at that time. And I walked into one gallery, and I was amazed by the work in there. I thought it was... an amazing amount of creativity and accomplishment and variety. And then I went up and down the street, and it was all, like Fisherman's Wharf stuff. It's all very commercial, very boring, and everything else. And then I went back to that gallery, and I walked all the way into the back, and I was ready to turn around to leave the gallery, and there's this big, tall, imposing man standing over me with his arms crossed, looking down at me, and he said, "You're an artist, aren't you?" And I said, well, actually, yeah, I've been here all summer. I was painting a show for a friend, and, I just finished that, and, I live in Denver, and I was going to go back. And he said, do you have any pictures? I said, yeah, I had some pictures in the truck. He said, come back at 5:30. And so I came back at 5:30, and this was John Pence, and he lived upstairs, and he looked through this portfolio, and he looked at all these pictures from the show I did. And, he looked at one, he said, well, I don't know what you're doing here. And look at another one. He goes, well, you're definitely not going to continue doing this stuff. And then he said, well, this is very, mundane. And he just went over and over. And then he saw one piece, and he just said, I don't know what you're doing here, but it's the only thing I see that's really worth looking at. It's sort of interesting that, might have some possibility. But he said, well, I have no idea what you're going to do, or if you're interested, or you're going to do that at all, or, if you have any desire to do that. And that's where he left it. And so I leave that night, and then I go back to San Rafael, and I can't sleep that whole night. I just kept thinking of this conversation and meeting this man and going over this thing. And it's like I'd never had anyone who so looked at the work in such a way and deconstructed it in a way that's just sort of like, okay, this you can dismiss, this you can dismiss, this is sort of curious, that is the most thing. And it's like, oh my God, I need this. This is what I need more than anything. So that was one of the paintings that didn't sell. I grabbed that, drove back into the city the next day, show up at the gallery unannounced, walk in there with this painting in my hand, and set it on the desk and said, I want you to keep this because I want to continue this dialogue, and I'm leaving for Denver tomorrow, and I just want to continue this dialogue. And he said, I don't do this sort of thing. This isn't what I do. This isn't how I work. This is very irregular. And I said, I don't know. This is all I know. This is what I have to do. And then I leave. And then I'm back in Denver. And, in like 10 days later, I get a check in the mail. And it's from John Pence. He bought the painting. And he said, do 15 more and we'll continue our conversation.
Whoa!
And so I, and I explained to him, I said, this was the one piece I did that I was most fascinated with, and I felt no one would understand it, no one would want to do it. I had no idea there would be even a market for it, but for some reason I was fascinated with this direction. And that was the one thing that he's like, this is all I want you to do. And
so you did another 15 pieces?
I did 15 pieces, and we talked, and he said, well, show me what you can do if you do 30. And then he said, if you do 50, we'll have a show. And so we had a show. And then by the end of opening night, 45 out of 50 were sold.
Now that's a story.
And it was just like, and then I was just off. And then he said, well, is this what you want to do? And I'm like, what are you talking about? Is this what you want to do?
I just did 50 works of art
yeah,
just as a...
for the heck of it, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And he had this talent. Where at that time he would do what he called a walkthrough. Uh-huh. He would have the show, you'd have the show, and then he would hang it. And then he would do a walkthrough, and he would tell you why he hung the pieces he did next to one another and what you were doing when you were doing these pieces. And suddenly it was like someone just opened up your psyche and exposed everything about who you were. And he said, and here, see what you did here? Look at what that is. And you would go, oh my God, you're right. I had no idea.
Oh, and he was really revealing things that you hadn't considered before.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so that was the whole formative years for me in San Francisco.
Right.
But then, he like moved his gallery. I helped him, because I had some construction skills. I built like his front desk. I built his loft. I did all the storage bins. I helped him, sort of create his whole new space. And then after about 3 or 4 years, I was like, I needed a break. I needed to get out of there. It just became too insular, with him and, the way he operated and ran things. And so that was when I met Tamara, and then I'd lost the lease in my studio in San Francisco, and I couldn't find a place, and didn't know what I was going to do. And so I just randomly said to her, I said, where can someone live cheaply and be inspired and just do their work? And she said, well, I was exchange student in Spain. It's really cheap. You could go there. I said, let's go there. So knowing each other 2 months, we just left and moved to Spain.
And kind of like a parent-child, I mean, that you had to differentiate yourself from this gallerist who had been such a sort of insightful parent figure for you. It really was.
It really was
and
that
so
kind
you
of
went
dynamic.
East, young man.
Yeah, I mean, it really felt like some ways like a rebellion against your parent.
Yeah.
And just saying, I can't. At a certain point, it was very helpful and sort of a growth process. And then at a certain point, it's like everything he told me just ended up making me more frustrated. It's like I didn't know what to do next. It's like nothing I did was right. Like everything I do was, and it's just like, I just got to get out of here. I got to get out of here and just figure out who I am.
So you go to Spain. I assume you don't speak Spanish.
I don't speak Spanish. It was but Tam was fluent. I wasn't. And so we made a great pair. I could drive, she couldn't, and so we just traveled and painted and spent our whole time just doing art.
Wow.
Yeah.
And was your child conceived?
No. We lived there for 3 years, mm-hmm. and then it became clear that I either had to stay there and establish myself and start showing there, or come back, because this was before the internet, and it was like trying to negotiate, with a gallery and sales, and it was just impossible. So I came back. And I lived briefly in Colorado, and I was convinced, like, I'm not going to go to San Francisco, have that experience, go to Spain, have that experience, and end up back home. Like, I'm not going to end up back in Denver. And so I sort of made a list of, things I wanted and needed and, where I could be. And Santa Fe and Seattle came up, sort of top on the list, and came down here one weekend to see, what it felt like or what would happen. And again, one of these just bizarre things, we stopped in, I don't know why, we stopped into some real estate agent or something just to talk about, are there houses or rentals or, how things work. And this lady was just sitting there at the desk, and she was asking about us, and she said, well, what are you looking for? And I said, well, I'd kind of like just a little adobe, maybe close to the river with Alamo trees and that sort of thing. It'd be nice. And she reached into her pocket, pulled out a keys, and handed it to us. She says, I've lived in this place for 12 years. I've moved in with my boyfriend. I need to find someone to rent it. I think this is perfect for you. It's like, this is a Santa Fe story.
Santa Fe story.
It's like Santa Fe either embraces you and gives you what you need, or throws you out.
Yeah.
And it's like, we went there, and it was like, the place was maybe 500 square feet, but it was perfect. And, it was like the rent was something I could cover, and it's like, okay, we'll take it, And so that's how I got here. We moved down here. It was in Tasuke. It was just across from the post office, down there right by the river. It was sweet.
Wow. And sort of Tasuke is such a cool transition from anywhere else, because it's still verdant and,
Well, it reminded us so much, because we were living on a farm in Spain, with vigas and all that stuff. So suddenly I'm, adobe walls and vigas, and, it's just like, semi-rural. It was like a perfect transition.
And so do you think Santa Fe, not the location, but the spirit of Santa Fe has charmed your work?
You know how I describe it? And I don't always recognize it until I go elsewhere. There's something about Santa Fe that is so freaking random and unorganized and chaotic, that you have $1 million home next to a trailer house, next to dead cars, next to, it's just like there's something about it that isn't conventional like so many other places, that you can be whoever you are here and no one thinks you're a weirdo. You can be an artist here and they're just like, oh, another one of those. Who cares?
The city of permission.
Yeah. And so, people go, oh, you came here for the light. I'm like, no, I came here because I could just be my weird self and no one cares.
That's so great, because what I've been having conversations lately about, the reason I asked about, how did you get to Santa Fe and why Santa Fe, is because I've got this notion now that Santa Fe is not just a location. It's sort of a state of mind. Yeah. And that's why people can either stay here
or they can't.
Because it's not about where the longitude and latitude and location of it. Yeah. It's really about, are you ready to be honest with yourself about what... now, that's not to say that everybody here is.
Right, yeah.
There are plenty of people who haven't...
They're like posers who are trying to relive the American myth of the American West or something,
Sure. Yeah. But the people who seem to really flourish here, and that's a word that I'm really interested in these days, flourish and thrive, seem to... It supports that. It attracts...
It has that capacity here, Yeah. There are reasons why, like Burning House or something broke down his buggy or whatever in Taos and stopped and never went any further. Yeah. Or George O'Keeffe arrived here and said, this is it. I've lived in New York, I've lived in upstate, and it's like, this is it. This is what allows me to do what I need to do. And Mabel Dodge, who brought people through here time after time, saying, just sit with it. Just sit here and see what hits you. It may hit you, it may not. But there's something about being here that just gives you permission to be who you are.
Do you think it could be replicated anywhere else?
I don't think so. I think people have tried, and I think it becomes a pseudo thing. I think, we've been here long enough to see a lot of changes and a lot of sort of packaging of Santa Fe. And, I think that's going to continue. But, there's still just the long history of what it is to being here that you still pick it up. It's the residue of that energy is here. It's just here.
Well, and it's longer than even the Anglo history. Obviously, there's something about that sort of
Native Americans, everything. Yeah, there's something about they ended up here. This is the crossroads for a lot of things happening.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and even now, I mean, not to sort of get off topic, but it's sort of on topic. I mean, this whole thing now with Oppenheimer, I'm fascinated with how many people will be introduced to something about New Mexico that maybe they didn't understand, and why did suddenly that happen here and not anywhere else? There was something that drew that energy here to create that kind of transformative event that completely changed the entire world, and it happened right here in our backyard. Well,
Mushroom Cloud, right?
This is my awareness because Sienna's movie is all about the consequences of developing the bomb here on sort of the downstream people. And, one of the first things she told me that was just like shocking is like, New Mexico is the only state that's been bombed by an atomic bomb. I'm like, we never think about it. But yeah, we were the only place where a bomb had been exploded in the state.
Wow.
That's
true.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And just down the way in Roswell,
yeah.
we have another sort of thing that's really unique to New Mexico, which is the whole sort of space alien
stuff.
connection.
Yeah.
And
New Mexico's an odd place. Yeah.
It sure is.
Yeah.
I just again, I'm just thinking I'm reconnecting all kinds of things in my brain right now as we're speaking. But I wonder what that will do in terms of bringing more people, whether it'll spark curiosity.
Well, I think it will. I think it will bring awareness to something that a lot of people don't associate with New Mexico. That is an important part of, our history. But no, I wanted to introduce that because, I think too many people are framing New Mexico from a perspective of sort of the tourist view of what you come here to see or do or whatever. But I introduced that to say, no, there's something about this that drew events and connections and sort of, I don't know, explosions in this community that wouldn't have happened anyplace else. Yeah, I most recognize it when I go back to Denver and visit my sister, who lives in a very wonderful neighborhood in Denver, really upscale sort of tract homes and, the best of amenities everywhere and, everything. And I feel my imagination slowly shrink as I'm up there. And I just think in terms of convention and more convention. This is how you lived your life, and this is how one comports, and these are the cars you drive, and these are the houses you live in. And then I come back here, and there's just, it all opens up again, and no, it's a free-for-all.
Well, now that is fascinating for somebody like you to be able to be subject to the force field of conventionality.
Oh, yeah, it's like water pressure coming down on you. Yeah. That's how it feels to me,
So, most of the places that you go when you leave Santa Fe are to places like Rome or New York or places that are going to expand.
Expansive,
what other types of places can you go where you actually feel the conventionality of what most of us live with in the United States?
All you have to do is drive through Middle America, and you're there. It's like everything's now a strip mall. Everything's now the same 4 or 5 stores. Every house is like a cookie cutter of another house. Everyone is driving the same sort of cars, watching the same it's just like we are programmed to expect a certain kind of lifestyle and a certain sort of presentation of the self or what we need to look like or be or comport ourselves, and that doesn't allow for any kind of aesthetic expression.
That's interesting. There's a book I'm just reading and they talk about aesthetic mindset. But interestingly enough, when I did my cross-country road trip right prior to coming to Santa Fe, I stopped in Ohio, across various stops across the Midwest, and that was some of the most interesting art in the urban pockets of those places. Some of the freshest art I've seen, not in terms of the actual art itself, but the way that the museums were reimagining interaction with the public. And I felt like, Europe and the coasts, they're so
hip and
groovy and sort of full of themselves.
The same thing. I mean, I had that experience. Like for years, I worked very closely with John Streetman in the Evansville Museum, and he did more innovative programs and more shows and more things than any museum I knew of in America. And it was like it's in the middle of the heartland of Indiana, and you're like, how did this happen in Indiana? And again, it was like there was New Harmony. There were all of these sort of alternative sort of things that were happening in the vicinity there that maybe was part of the energy that created that thing, but also it was him. It was the energy that he brought and what he tried to create there.
So I wonder if that's sort of our great hope, is that even with this sort of homogenization that you're describing of our culture and the pressures for us to conform to a particular way, you still have these little hotbeds of creativity and where that spark, where anybody who has the, what is it that takes us out of our comfort zone? I don't know. And to mingle with that and to kind of keep us. I think it's bubbling and it's just below the surface. One doesn't know how to tap that, how to get it to be fully expressed. It's the thing that fascinates me. The why I enjoy doing some of the workshops. It's like I try to find what it is that they're trying to do or what they're trying to express and say, yeah, you can do that. That's your strength. Go for it. And I'll give you a few tools to try to help you get there. Yeah.
Well,
because right now I feel like we live at a time where we really need to get out of our comfort zones and think outside the box just to solve our own personal problems,
absolutely.
Let alone the global issues that we face. And so another reason that I find that these conversations so fruitful for me, and the reason that I want to share them with other people, is I find that there's the way creatives approach life in general has a really important message for how we're going to solve our world problems.
Yeah, because so much of it is it's organic, it's not linear, it's counterintuitive quite often, and then it's like suddenly there's an epiphany. And then you suddenly realize how all these things fed into this realization, but then that's not the end. It's just the step for the next series of revelations and fascinations and processes that bring you to the next place, and then you just keep moving on.
So you've said that the sort of where you're working on right now is integration. What comes after integration? Do we even know? I mean, we sort of I think about life as dealing with these, making sense of polar opposites. And then once
then it's manifestation.
Ooh, yeah.
And ultimately that's the key. It's like we want to see certain results. And how do you get to the point where you go, this is it. I'm occupying what is, and this is it.
All right. Well, that's the perfect place to end it. This is it. All right. Thanks. So thanks for joining us today. Please like and follow us on artstorming.org, where you'll find a list of our shows, a transcript of this episode, with links to the guest page, as well as our other projects. ArtStorming is brought to you and supported by ArtBridge and listeners like you. Look for us on your favorite podcast platforms.